one of the things that I had not appreciated previously is the depth of intellectual thinking in Russia that there is about war, the extent to which the Russians see war both as a science and an art, a topic, if you like, for academic study. And this is done at the very highest levels of the Russian military. So perhaps that's a point to start with, but you can take us from there, because I do not know, and I think you said this right at the start of your book, there is no analogous body of study of war that goes to the depth and approaches it with the same kind of rigor as the Russians do. So can you just enlarge on that a little, and then we can perhaps talk a bit about the theoretical underpinnings and then look at the war that we're seeing now?
Yes, no, thank you. As you said before, my previous job, as I was in strategic intelligence, was precisely, especially in the Cold War, was precisely trying to understand how the Soviet would think. And you may remember that at that time we were planning, or let's say, how the words are missing, but we were fearing a war every 3 days, basically. And so we tried to understand how the Soviets figure out war, how they wage war, how they would wage war, how they think war. And I was in charge at the time of the Warsaw Pact, and all the Warsaw Pact countries had the same, more or less, thinking system. So I studied that. I was not the only one, by the way. I was in touch with other intelligence services who were concerned with the same kind of questions. And we developed also on the Western side quite a deep knowledge of how the Soviets think war. Today, I noticed, because I continued to study a little bit the issue of war and how the Soviet would consider war, and I noticed that there were not real changes. If you remove the Marxist crust, basically you have the same way of thinking and approach to the question of war. And as you rightly said, and probably comes a little bit also from a Marxist perspective, that everything has to be scientifically studied. And war was a scientific study in the Soviet Union, and not even scientific, but also academic in the sense. And that's very interesting. For example, very little people understand that. But during the Afghan war, and I was also responsible for following the war in Afghanistan at that time, I noticed there were a lot of exchanges within military reviews or papers, exchanged between people in the field and the people in Moscow about war, how war should be understood, how war in Afghanistan differs from the war that was anticipated in Europe and things like that. And you had very vivid exchanges in the military press. So meaning that they considered the military not just as a matter of course, it was a matter of security, but it was also considered as a matter of intellectual challenge to understand the enemy, understand how the enemy works. And in fact, I noticed that the Soviets at the time knew better how the Mujahideen work than we tried to understand how to do Mujahideen work as NATO was in Afghanistan. So that the understanding of the enemy was much deeper in the Soviet Union than it was in NATO later. And that's a very much this whole approach of war that consider not just your own capacities, but also the capacities of the enemy or the adversary. And that is exactly when as I said, I was in NATO from 2012 to 2017, which is quite strange for a Swiss guy, but that was the result of a discussion between the Swiss government and NATO in the framework of the Partnership for Peace. And I was given a position in NATO, which I was the only Swiss officer working in NATO. But that was a critical time of 2014. And then I realized that the thinking in NATO was not deep enough to understand what was going on in the Donbass and basically in the southern part of Ukraine. This was a very ethnocentric approach to war, basically. They assumed that the Soviet or the Russians or the enemies basically would think like NATO. And that really struck me, and that's the reason why when the special operation started in February 2022, I decided to write books, because this is the Art of War is the fourth book that I wrote about this conflict. But and I wanted to make clear that the Russians understand us better than we understand them. And as you know, if you read the Art of War or Sun Tzu, when you know the enemy less good than you know yourself, then you are almost certain to lose. And that's exactly the situation in which we are. We didn't try to understand the Russians because everything they say is propaganda, everything they are incapable, and so on and so forth. And we rely only on what we understand from them. As a result, we went into this conflict with a total incomplete view of the issue, and the purpose of this last book is very much to show what are the holes in our understanding.